little do they realise that we're talking like 100 to 200 times the thickness of the paint on the walls, and it's just not possible. And they don't have any way of testing whether it is possible, because even the gauges to test intumescent on steel, they cost like $5,000. Like it's not worth it. So you have to get someone that's an expert to install it.
Fireproof, the Passive Fire podcast, where we delve into the world of passive fire protection. Join the Pro Finish team as we dig into the issues we see on site and in our industry every day, and find out how you can save time, money, and headaches on major construction projects.
So on the certification side of things, what do your clients receive in terms of certificates, and what is actually required by law?
I'll talk about certificates. So our team do a really good job of putting together a handover. So we spoke briefly about project offboarding before. So at the end of the project, the account's settled. We're providing a handover document that will have cover page. It'll have a certificate of compliance, which may or may sometimes they're signed off by the manufacturer as well, because we're an approved applicator. A warranty, depending on whether that's required as part of the project, but usually there's some form of warranty. And then there's all of the project documentation that's required as well. So it might be QAs, ITPs, the test reports, the product technical guide. I'm trying to reel it off the top of my head.
Data sheets, yeah.
Data sheets.
Yeah.
So it ends up being quite an extensive document, and that's part of your, I suppose, as-built at the end of the project. So that's what we're providing.
Yeah, and then from a just like what from a certification perspective, and how, I suppose like who can install it? How do you become an installer? It's an interesting one, because in Queensland it's a registered trade. I still wouldn't say that it's like a focus by any means. Still gets kind of pushed to the side, but within Sydney and Victoria, just recently they've released an FPAS accreditation. It's still not supported by, I suppose, like a governing body. Like it's kind of like an institution that's just popped up that's runs a very good course and has done for a long time. So it's still not a requirement, but a lot of surveyors and mostly building surveyors and sort of like
fire engineers,
they're all requiring that you have an FPAS accreditation. But that's normally for penetrations. For installing the product themselves, often you have to be an approved installer by the supplier. And so that's kind of the most, I suppose, like, I don't know, certification. Like that's kind of that's what you need essentially to install the product and how you do it. And then from there, it's all about your QAs and your ITPs, because ultimately the building surveyor is the one that's going to sign off on it, and they're not experts in passive fire. It's become, and I've spoken to surveyors about this, it's become their most annoying or their most focused sort of area is focusing on this, because there's just so much risk attached to it. It hasn't been done right for a long time. It's just been getting through, and what's kind of happening now is there's all these. It happened on the back of a lot of the fires. And unfortunately, people are losing their lives. They're looking to why this happened, and then they realise, a compliance system wasn't actually installed. And so, like, the scrutiny's really sort of come down, and it's really tightened up, which has been really good. But we still have some ways to go. And so, from a certification perspective, like I said, it often sits with the suppliers. Like, you have to be an approved installer. And so, we get a lot of calls about mum and dads and like people at home just asking if they can install certain products themselves. Like, say, for example, someone built a pergola out the back with steel, and it's within 3 meters of the boundary. Very often that steel needs to be fire rated. It's like a 60 minutes or something like that. And so they'll Google up fire rating for steel, and they'll find like there's a paint. And most people think like, oh, sweet, I can paint the walls of my house. I can paint this steel post. Little do they realise that we're talking like 100 to 200 times the thickness of the paint on the walls, and it's just not possible. And they don't have any way of testing whether it is possible, because even the gauges to test intumescent on steel, they cost like $5,000. Like it's not worth it. So you have to get someone that's an expert to install it. So that's kind of where the certification sort of sits, is that it's that relationship between the passive fire installer and the supplier.
All right, the next question is there an audit process? How do I know what you have installed is going to meet the requirements?
Yeah, I think it probably comes back to what you were just saying. You've got a a surveyor who might not be an expert in passive fire. You've got a builder also who may not be an expert in passive fire. So how do we provide a very transparent outline of what's being installed, what the ITP process is, so how it's being inspected and tested throughout the installation process, and how a QA is being completed, and showing that the QAs are compliant. So if we use spray, for example, it is that we got to test the thickness of the spray on the steel, so of the vermiculite, and the guys will have to do that on multiple locations every day. They'll submit a form which will show the thickness that was required, what was tested, the measurement that they took. They'll take a photo of that spot and they'll submit that. And at the end of the project, we'll compile all that together, and that'll become part of the QA report. So that's an example for the spray side. And the same applies in all the products that we use, basically.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's happening now a lot too is, especially in the tier 1, tier 2 space, like they're the ones that a lot of time it comes down to like governance and like making, like they're thinking a lot more longer term, right? Like your land leases and your multiplexes and stuff like that. They're thinking about the longevity of the building, and they know their buildings are going to get yearly inspections, and they're going to be liable for those kind of things. And so they're always thinking about best practice. And so what's happening in more the top end of the game, the top space, is they're actually starting to have a lot more third-party audits now. And so they're requiring that on the project. They'll have an installer, and then they'll have a third-party auditor come through. And so we're sort of playing both sides. We're playing, obviously, the installer and the auditor. And it's really, really promising to see this. The downside, obviously, is the cost. Because short-term, it's going to cost you, most likely it's going to cost you more, because you're going to have to engage a third-party person to be able to bring them in. But then in the long run, like you're betting and you're ensuring that that the product that has been installed actually is going to meet the requirements, and it's going to pass every year on year. And so we often see that with people that don't want to go down that road. They're taking a bet that what they are installing is going to pass in the future, and they haven't checked it and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so essentially, if the good thing is with when you bring on a third party auditor, is that you're guaranteeing that the works are being done correctly, and you're guaranteeing it for the future. When you go to the other path and you just kind of accept that the certificates, what people have given you, and you just go down that path, well, then you're leaving yourself potentially at risk for future inspections to be wrong. And so the other piece that's actually been thrown into this, because that's how it's been done for a long time, is that people will just take the certificate and go, yep, sweet. And even the surveyor has been doing that.
Yep.
What's changed for the better is that surveyors, because of the pressure they're under and because they're the ones ultimately kind of certifying things and ticking them off, is that they've become better and better at the passive fire game. And so what's actually happening is at the end of the job, they're almost like the auditor themselves. And so they're picking up on a lot of these little things now. And the moment they start picking up on one thing, it's in one area, you know that it's going to be the same across the whole job. And so at that point is when it all starts to unravel. And unfortunately, building surveyors, and this is their job, so it's not anything against them, but they come through towards the back end of they're always at the end of the job. Like they're always after the install, because they're checking things. And so a lot of the time there'll be like ceilings installed, tiles installed, like the job's getting close to sort of that handover period. And so if things are picked up on then, like if they find something, it is a nightmare. You have to pull down ceilings, you have to pull off some tiles in certain areas, you have to it's an absolute nightmare. And so the rectification costs just blow out compared to what it should have cost in the short term. So that's kind of how the things are audited, and that's how things are kind of certified and stuff like that on site, and like who sort of plays that role. And it is super important, I think, to get an audit done on your project.
Yeah, so and that's where you might have an installer, but then you might also have engage another passive fire company just as an auditor.
Yeah,
and I think that's what you're getting at is builders now are starting to do that, just so that they got that third party verification of everything that's being installed throughout the project, and they know when they get to the to that final stage of having the surveyor there that everything's okay.
Absolutely.
So for them, it's kind of like a bit of insurance, and I think we definitely play on both sides. We have a lot of, the way that you said it was done in the past is we would do our own QA, we would provide that documentation, and essentially the builder or the surveyor are auditing that. That's what I was getting at the start. We're providing it in a way that they can read and understand what's been done, and then they can go and verify it for themselves, and essentially they're auditing it. But a lot of times you might have a subcontractor installing penetrations. They might not be doing that level of QA and documentation themselves. So that's when, at the end of the project, you're coming unstuck. And in those instances, a third-party auditor is really valuable.
Definitely.
Okay, next question is there a trade for the passive fire industry, and how do you become certified?
Yep, we kind of touched on this a little earlier too. So short answer is there's no trade in Victoria and New South Wales. Queensland currently has a trade, and you can add it on to like your carpentry license or plastering license a lot of the time. But within Sydney and Victoria and I can't remember about WA and South Australia. I think South Australia is the same, but essentially there's no trade. But there is now FPAS accreditation, which has just been brought through. It's a kind of like a governing body.
Yep.
And a lot of surveyors and fire engineers are requiring that to be installers to have that. And so, but outside of that, it sits with the supplier and the installer.
Yep. So, and the FPAS, the Fire Protection Accreditation Scheme, is what that stands for. And that's by the FPAA, which is the Fire Protection Association of Australia. So I guess that's kind of like the governing body for what we do, which is both passive fire and wet fire. And the passive fire part is now a course in itself.
Yep.
And I think in the past it was an area that maybe just got skipped over because there's obviously also a lot of complexity in the wet fire side. And people often just disregarded the passive, but now that's becoming a certification as well. And hopefully we'll get to the point in Victoria and New South Wales where it is a trade. And hopefully it's not limited to just carpenters, because we've got really good sparkies. We've got people who have been plumbers, people that have been waterproofers. We find that it's really important to have that kind of construction background. And if you have a trade, usually that, the knowledge and skills that you've built up in that trade is transferable into what we do with internal training as well.
Yep.
So.
All right. This is definitely one of the most common questions that you guys get is it best to install intermittent on-site or off-site?
Comes up a fair bit.
Yeah, heaps.
Fortunately, we can do both.
Yeah, that's right. So for the majority, it depends a lot on the planning. So we would prefer, and it's normally more cost effective, and you can just control the environment when it's done off-site, so within a controlled environment factory. Like we've got a factory that we have with sister company Profinish Coatings. And so it comes down to a lot of the time, planning and programming. Again, best case scenario, get it to us before it's installed. We get like 7 to 10 days with it normally, depending on the volume of steel, obviously. And then post sort of 2 weeks, we get it to site, they can install it, and then we do on-site touch-ups from there. It doesn't always go down that path. Like sometimes you have to get the structure up and continue with the build. And so you definitely can do it on-site. It's just now you're dealing with the weather. Being in Victoria and even Sydney, like very wet, very humid, like can get very cold. And so, we have a lot of issues with the conditions in which you can paint in. Paint just unfortunately isn't a very like hardy kind of product. And so you have to paint within the right conditions. And then if the conditions aren't right and you're going through a winter phase, you might have to change like a solvent-based product, which you do have a little bit more tolerance with. If you're using a solvent-based product, now you're dealing with like health and safety issues, ventilation. A lot of the times, you're not allowed to have a solvent-based product on site, or when others are there, and so you potentially have to shut down areas of the site and the workforce anyway. So, it's the time saving just isn't really there. People think it is, but a lot of the time it's not, and so there's a lot of different factors that have to come into play.
I would say programming is obviously the biggest consideration. We would prefer if it's a new build and new steel that it comes to us first. But even then, the programming is still a consideration because depending on the volume of steel, like it's all got to be fabricated and it's all got to be sent. So, you know, we could have steel coming in dribs and drabs as it's fabricated, and then it's getting on site and it's actually not coming through quick enough to actually meet the install time. So, so many of those factors are at play. So, but if you've got a steel fabricator who can supply the steel and, you know, one go or you know, as minimal loads as possible, and we can get it all into the factory. We can lay it all out and have it all sprayed and maybe not completed, but we might do. We might build the thickness of the inchmeson and maybe not top coat it, because that way when it gets to site, we can do the touch ups and top coating on site. So again, there's multiple options. I think for the best cost saving and also the best probably outcome in terms of the aesthetic of the product, we would do it in our factory, ship it to site with maybe a little one thin layer left, or maybe just we even do the whole thickness of inchmeson, but we top coat it on site, so we get a really good finish, and that's probably the best way to do it.
It's definitely the best. Like just from a visual perspective, if you visualize like 20 steel members all around a build, and you think of like a big, you know, multi-story building, like all of those steel members scattered around the build, like you have to move around, like there's so much more square meterage that you have to cover and mask up and protect with that, as opposed to getting all of those steel beams, putting them together like 100 mil or, you know, a couple 100 mil away from each other in a factory and spraying them all at once.
Yeah, that's right.
Like from a square meterage perspective, it is so much more effective, and it's such a smaller area that you're having to install this on. It's going to be installed quicker. And so it just makes sense to do it that way.
But I think there'd be instances where the steel install is going to be one of the critical sort of drivers on the project. That's going to be a critical path. So having that extra week or 2 weeks to get the steel coated might not be in the program. So they're basically getting it installed on site and building above as we're coming through, and then applying the inchmeson. So there'll definitely be times when that 2 weeks is more valuable than than actually sending the steel to us first. So, and then I think when you've got existing builds, so renovations and those sorts of things, the structure might already be in place, so you don't have a choice really but to do it on site.
How long does it take to get mobilised and be on site?
Yeah, so we normally sort of say, it comes back to the question a little earlier with product timelines too. So if the product is available, we can be we normally need 3 to 4 days. We like to say a week. But also depends on the size of the job. So if it's going to be like require 20 or 30 labourers, you're going to want a couple of weeks at least, sort of 2 to 4 weeks. So the earlier the better. And then often what isn't considered in that is once you receive kind of initial approval, there's still like a contract negotiation phase. And so clients often forget about that point. They think that just like the moment we give you approval, you should start. Well, when are you paying us? Like what's the terms of the site? Like there's just all these little sort of things that we try to get on the front end, but they have to be worked through. And so I would normally say, just to keep it simple, it's normally about a week turnaround for most jobs, but then that can push out to like 4 weeks depending on the size. If it's a really big job, it's got a lot of product, there's going to be some supply issues most likely if it's a big job. And so you could be looking at even 4 to 8 weeks. We're looking at a job in Sydney right now, and we've told them it's sort of a bit of an 8-week lead time, but they've got a lot of product and a lot of labour they need. So that's sort of, I think, the rough timeframes.
Yeah. Look, it's one of the most common questions that I would get. Like, I'm not really involved in the sales side of it day to day, but if I do get someone give me a call, they're like, "Hey, we've got this come up. Could you get guys here Friday?" And it's like, all right, well, what does that mean? What is it? send us some photos. We'll get the team onto it. And a lot of times we can. And I think one of our strengths is that because we have built quite a large team now, quite a diverse team, we can move things around to accommodate people in most instances. So
absolutely,
we have had projects that we're there tomorrow.
Yeah,
and it probably creates chaos for the team here.
Yeah, the project managers aren't so happy about that.
And even organising pre-starts and logistics, getting deliveries there, organising pick lists and things late at night for a next day start. Can be a nightmare, but we can get it done. So And I think, ideal scenario, 1 to 2 weeks, but we're here to accommodate what people need.
Absolutely. That's been one of our strengths. We never wanted to say like no to a customer because we were too busy. Like we always wanted to be able to accommodate someone because we understand that the time it takes to in the lead up, like let's say you've worked with someone, you've designed the project great, like you've gone through the estimating process and you understand your costs, and then you're a month or two out and all of a sudden they're not available. Like you've just built this relationship you've built this trust with someone, and then for them to pull out is like, I can't imagine ever doing that. Like I know of some people that have done that, and it's just like it's always blown me away. I get it. Sometimes they're busy, but we never wanted to do that, and so we knew that we had to be of a certain size to be able to sort of cater and move things around and accommodate for that. And it's something I think is one of our strengths, is that we really do make it happen and make it work. We'll move things around and we'll work with clients to do for the different things, or we'll hire or we'll subcontract or whatever, so that even if we can't complete 100% of the works, we're still the ones managing it and looking after the quality of it and the QAs, the ITPs, et cetera. And so the project will still get delivered as we promised.
Yep.
And so I think that's been really something we've really focused on.
For sure.
Well, on team, and our final question for this episode is, what is the structure of the team on site? Who will the client be dealing with?
Depends who the client is. As in, like, you'd have to define the word client because, from our point of view, the client is going to be probably a project manager.
Yep.
But the on-site team for that company might be someone else. So it might be a site manager and a contract administrator.
Yep.
So there's definitely layers. But I think the way that we've generally structured our delivery business, or the delivery side of the business, is into specialised departments.
Yep.
We have a project manager for our vermiculite and spray and duct work. We have a project manager for our board work, project manager for our penetrations and fire stopping. So you're generally dealing with that person. They're the lead on the communication. But then on site, we'll, depending on the size of the job, we'll either have a crew leader or a site supervisor who might be the go-to on site for that site manager. So that's all made clear to the client when we do that handover process.
Absolutely.
It's going to work.
And we spoke about this a little bit earlier too. Like you'll normally have that one person that's leading it. Remember, I said that there's normally two kind of main people they would deal with. It'll be like the passive fire consultant, and it'll be the project manager. They're kind of the two people responsible for the relationship or responsible for the project. And so within those teams, though, that we then have like a lot of teams that support them, like Russell said, like there'll be a delivery aspect, there'll be like a customer service aspect, there'll be a finance aspect, there'll be a site manager. There's all these sort of different things that come into it, but essentially you're still dealing with that one person that's managing the relationship. They're just using the resources that we have built within the company to be able to answer the questions. And so that's how we kind of set things up.
Yeah. So I think it's really important that you always go back to that, the individual who's really assigned to manage the relationship. And in most cases, that's going to be the project manager when it comes to the delivery side of the business. But we understand day to day, your site team is going to be dealing with our site team. And a lot of times that's just day-to-day programming and site management, and hey, can you guys work here tomorrow instead of here? And it's like, yeah, they can figure that out on site because we've got competent foremen or crew leaders on site that can do that. But when it comes to progress and where the job's at, it's always back to the project manager.
Great. Well, that's it, guys. Awesome answers to all those common questions.
Thanks, mate.
Cool. Yeah, it was good. Thanks for joining us today,
thanks
Nathan.
for joining us.
No problems.
Yeah.
Good to be back in Victoria.
Kind
of.
Except you come back in the coldest June ever, I think, in the last
really.
11 years or something.
Of course it is. Freezing.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
See ya.
guys.